Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Deloitte University. I guess you guys have been here a couple hours now, so hopefully the afternoon's going well for you. So today I've got the distinct pleasure and honor to do a little fireside chat, although, Chris, we don't have a fire up here, so I guess we're going to have to just, wing it. But we have a special guest with us today, the co-founder and CEO of Box, Inc., Aaron Levie. So Aaron, why don't you come up and join me? All right. Hey, thanks for being here. All right, let's, I think, Aaron, first thing we got to do, though, because I don't, this is our house. This is the Deloitte house.
Yeah.
So I always start moving furniture.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So when I get here. So we're not just talking straight out there. But thank you for being here.
Yeah.
So we have assembled an awesome group here. We've got, as I mentioned to you, a whole host of clients, C-suite execs, chief AI and data officers, a whole bunch of folks, and then a bunch of our Deloitte leaders here as well. And when I heard about this session, and I heard that there was a chance to get to spend a few minutes with you, what they used to say on radio shows, long-time listener, first-time caller. I kind of feel like that today, getting to spend some time with you. Because
oh, wow. Okay.
I've been following you on X for a long time. And for those of you who don't know, Aaron is prolific on X in talking about the advent of AI, how AI is going to transform the enterprise, and especially about agentic AI. And you've been tweeting quite a bit about that. I guess, can we still call it tweeting?
Yeah, so actually, even Elon goes back and forth. He has not fully adopted his own vocabulary that he forced on us all. So we can call it tweeting if you want.
I guess we wouldn't call it Xing, right?
I think he wanted to call it posting, but that really is, that kind of loses the pizzazz. So
it does.
But yes, I spend way too much time online if that's what your core point is.
No.
So just lots of posts out there.
That's not my point at all. In fact, we've been undergoing, as like a lot of organizations, a big, redoing our strategy, right?
Yeah.
Really understanding the implications of AI. And I keep telling a lot of our folks that are working on our strategy team, I'm like, you've got to follow Aaron. So if your follower count's gone up, I don't know, you've got
I did notice this, Deloitte contingent just showed up one day.
Just showed up? Okay.
Just all following.
That's me.
So thank you. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
I don't know if there's some kind of referral there.
There's no limit of followers, so anybody can join.
All these folks.
Yes.
It's at Levie, Levie.
I made it very easy.
Yes. Okay. Super simple. So, well, Aaron, why don't we start the conversation? I think it'd be great for the team here to hear about your journey, because.
Actually, sorry. Can I do one quick survey?
Please.
Who is actively on X? Maybe raise your hand. It's always hard to know who actually is using this stuff these days. Is it 12-year-olds or CIOs? Okay. So the reason I call out X is the one benefit of it. Just if you want a chance of rebooting your interest in social media, is basically the AI community on X is kind of ground zero for everything that's happening in AI. And unfortunately, the problem is it does take a little bit of time to get your feed perfectly set up. You have to do a lot of unfollowing and you have to like the right things and never do not like any political posts, because your whole feed will turn into politics. So you have to be it's a very sensitive algorithm, but if you get it just right, you actually get this sort of view into the future of what all of your team members are going to talk about in 3 or 6 months from now. You'll see it before everybody else. Because what's happening is all of the founders of Cursor and Cognition and Claude and OpenAI and all of the dev teams and all the researchers are basically, X has become the native platform for everybody to share what they're seeing. So it is this cheat code, because you are kind of getting access to the future. So just as my one pitch, whether or not you follow me, it doesn't matter, but you will get better visibility into what's happening and what will come down the pike in a year or two from now. People on X got to learn about vibe coding within 30 minutes of the word existing. That's the access you get, because one day Andrej Karpathy just wrote about vibe coding, and he just defined it, and everybody who was online right then just read it, and maybe at the moment we didn't know that was going to become a big thing, and then eventually it sort of takes off. So, or MCP will just be one little blog post that Claude puts out there, but then you get access to it before everybody else. So that'd be my one pitch, to stay kind of current on all this stuff.
Well, I think it's a great pitch, because the debates happening there too, right?
Yes,
because
exactly.
As you and I have been talking about this, like there's no one clear answer. Nobody's got the actual crystal ball. So seeing the conversation happen live and seeing people debate and take different sides.
I think it helps to see. It actually helps to see exactly the debate, because then you can actually, all of these things compound on prior conversations and prior events. And so if you don't have the sort of formulation of like, why are they talking about that? Why are they talking about agents are actually going to be LLM calls in a loop versus this group is talking about agents are actually like workflow graphs, and that's the definition of agents. And so unless you can kind of piece all that together, then your team shows up with some recommendation and you don't know to go along with it or not, because you know it may have gone down the wrong kind of rabbit hole in the debate that the world has already kind of moved on from. So I find it's actually very helpful for keeping our strategy as kind of current as possible.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so let's rewind the clock a little bit. One thing Aaron and I discovered when I was doing a little bit of research on Aaron, and almost made me not want to do this interview, but so I'm a UCLA Bruin, and I graduated maybe, I don't know, a decade or so before Aaron was at the University of Southern California.
Yeah.
I almost called it that other thing that UCLA Bruins call it, but I'll keep it polite.
This is a
here.
long-lasting rivalry, apparently.
Long-lasting, especially for those not from Southern California might not know, but SC UCLA goes way back.
But you guys always had the better campus, so you shouldn't be that mad at me.
That is true. There's a lot of things better, but but that being said, so take us back to the founding of Box, because I think it'd be really instructive for the everyone to hear that story.
Yeah, so we started Box in 2005. We got the idea in like late 04, and basically, if you can kind of bring your mind back to kind of 04 IT landscape, basically we're in this transition period from the internet bubble had kind of like not fully sort of kind of worked out in at least an enterprise standpoint. Like Amazon was working, Yahoo was working, but nothing really reshaped kind of enterprise software. You're still on Siebel, still on Lotus, SharePoint on-prem, et cetera. And we basically said, like, why is it so hard to just work with our data from anywhere? And so we had this idea that had been tried in the 90s, but not super successfully, which is we'll just put data online securely and then let you access it from anywhere. And so we launched this company. It was initially called Box.net, and the idea was just put all your files in the cloud. It wasn't yet called the cloud, but concept existed. And then access it from anywhere. And so we launched it. We actually, kind of coincidentally, we actually raised our first round of funding from Mark Cuban, which led us to dropping out of college in our junior year, and then we moved to the Bay Area. But the idea basically remained the same, although we sort of pivoted fully into the enterprise, which was, if you imagine with mobile devices, cloud, all the different software that was emerging across SaaS, Salesforce, ServiceNow, et cetera, we thought you would need a secure place to be able to keep your unstructured data and then access it from anywhere, share it with anyone, embed it into your software. And instead of having either on-prem systems that wouldn't connect to the cloud very easily, or fragmented IT architectures in the cloud, we gave you one central repository for your most important unstructured data with an easy user interface and a deep kind of focus on security. So that's what we've been building out. Now, conveniently, actually, all of that work ended up becoming a necessary ingredient for the world that we're now in with AI. We didn't know it at the time, obviously, but those things have kind of played an important role now in our strategy.
Yeah, so, well, I'm sure the audience is wondering the same thing I am. So did you have to give Cuban a Shark Tank pitch? Or this was probably pre-Shark Tank
This was
days,
pre-Shark
right?
Tank. This was post-broadcast.com being sold to Yahoo. He was spending his billions.
Already probably owned the Mavs.
He owned the Mavs, and he was one of the. I mean, this is how early we were in this sort of new phase of the internet. There was probably no more than about 5 people on the internet that wrote about angel investing and investing in startups. It just wasn't a thing. It wasn't as popular of a thing to do. And so he was one of the people. So we just emailed him, and he responded in a couple hours. And then a few weeks later, a month or two later, he invested in the company. So we were very, very fortunate to have him on board.
So it was an Indiana alum that invested in some SC students to go build this company. Okay.
Yes. So
my son's a freshman at Indiana, so Aaron and I were talking about that. But so now you find yourself, kind of coming through, so that I actually came out of college in '95 in the Bay Area in the first .com wave.
Yep.
And there was so much investment in infrastructure at that time, right? And you kind of referenced it. We had this, most would call the kind of .com 1.0 bubble that essentially burst in 2001. On X, playing out in the media, everybody's asking, are we in that kind of time frame again? How would you compare and contrast those computing waves we've hit?
Yeah, so I think it's a good conversation to have. Obviously, if you're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars of CapEx, we should at least have the conversation.
Or billions, tens of billions.
Yeah, tens of billions even would cause you to want to have the conversation. So I think it's good that this is the conversation that's being had at the moment on the infrastructure side. A couple big differences though. Back in the build out of let's say the fiber infrastructure build out, we had, I don't know, let's say hundreds of millions of people online max globally. Now we're at 6 or 7 billion people online, something like that. So you have, kind of 2+ orders of magnitude of people on the internet that now have access to all the tools that are getting built. So you have a way bigger kind of TAM just by default of getting access to these technologies. And then I think there's something markedly different about what we were kind of figuring out on the internet, which was a great sort of distribution mechanism for goods and services and entertainment and media, versus what AI does, which is it basically is an augment to kind of human capability. And so the TAM, that at least I have concluded, and I think investors certainly conclude, is it's more the TAM of kind of human labor.
Yeah.
And so that's just a very large number. And so it's not that hard to kind of underwrite this as a multi-trillion dollar category over the next 10 to 20 years. And so when you see things like Meta, hiring a researcher for a few $100 million, obviously on one hand that's insane, and it's like, okay, we're now reaching NBA all all-star.
Shohei Ohtani.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, just to use a reference.
Yeah, I mean that's the level that we're now at. But then on the other side, the other way to frame it is if Meta's going to go build out 50 or 100 or 150 billion dollars of capex, a couple people are the determining factor to whether all of that capex is useful or not. And so if you're going to spend $100 billion on capex and you spend 1 or 2% on that on talent, that might be a 2x difference in whether you get those GPUs to produce something extremely useful for your company or not. And so that kind of puts it all into perspective of actually how important this is and the investment build out. But yeah, I mean it's just a totally different world. I mean we're when you look at today, and then the other angle is people just say, well, like how could there be that much consumption of these tokens? And I'll just maybe from at least how we kind of see it at Box, we have. If you go to Box right now and you use our AI features and you talk to your documents or summarize information, that's sort of, let's say, some amount of tokens being used. We have features that we are working on with customers right now that will probably use about 1,000 times more tokens than that base use case. Mm-hmm. And the economic value to the customer on that second use case is just, it's massive because you're automating entire workflows around what you would do with your unstructured data. And so the thing that maybe some of the analysts don't see always is they don't see that our consumption patterns as a software player are maybe going to go up about 1,000x over the next 5 or 10 years based on the use cases that everybody here has for working with their data. And so we actually do need a massive infrastructure build out to make this all possible. That means energy, that means data centers, that means chips. And so we are in the very early stages. Now, there's going to be a lot of dollars lost along the way. Like people will make the wrong investment in the wrong AI model, or something will blow up about some dead instrument. But as a general arc, you either believe that AI is going to automate a good chunk of today's work, not all work, but today's work, or you don't. And I think you have a lot of people believing that actually it will automate a lot of today's work.
Yeah. Well, two things that I want to touch on that you talked about. So first, let's go to the talent dimension. So, you're running an incredible company in the Valley, been at it for almost 20 years now, right? So you've seen the talent, the war for talent, really heightened recently. So how do you compete with the frontier model players, with the Metas, the open AIs who have the valuation they can throw $100 million at a researcher?
Yeah, I mean, so the good news is that's still a relatively rare event. It'll be a very big problem if that kind of moves up the stack. But the leverage on a few of the right researchers is so massive because these guys have figured out what kind of data sources are the best ones to train a model on? How do you configure the GPUs to be as, lose as little of the compute cycles as possible? So there's just some magic in having those experiences on the research side. Fortunately, I think for us and probably many of folks in this room, we actually need just kind of fairly typical strong computer science individuals, distributed systems, just very good software programmers, because we're building at the layer above the research. And so we are, at Box, we're basically an applied AI company. So we want to take the best AI models, and we want Anthropic to spend hundreds of billions of dollars burning on building that out. And then we want to take that innovation and apply it to the data and the workflows that are within Box. So what we want are engineers that are really good at that problem. That's actually a problem that was pretty similar to building software 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, with a couple big differences. One, you just need to deeply understand what's going on in AI. So there's a lot of fluency that we build internally to make sure all of our engineers deeply understand actually what's happening in AI. And then the second thing is that we've raised the expectation of what we expect our engineers to be delivering via using AI. And so this is more of a situation where we're now looking, and talent coming in, for an aptitude for using AI to code and to be able to actually have greater output than what we would have had 3 or 5 years ago. So I'd say we're in a period right now where software engineering practices have changed more than at any point in history. And the rate of that change is only accelerating, and the output levels that you get are the greatest gap between two exact same engineers with just different workflow patterns. You could have a 4x difference in output. And that has never happened, at least in my career of doing software for 25 years. And so we're literally at a point where the same individual with a different workflow pattern will produce 4 times more or 4 times less.
So one of the situations that I'm sure many in the audience are facing is, so how do you distinguish in the interview process, or more likely, they've already got a pretty large cadre of developers, right? So you already had hundreds, if not more than 1,000, right, on your team. How do you go through the kind of talent assessment to say, hey, these are the folks that are actually going to be able to get 4x or 10x the productivity and throughput versus these individuals, they're probably not going to make that jump?
I'd say without having people that have actually literally shown that they do it, I have no way in advance of knowing. I just have no idea. And so I've sort of given up on trying to predict on the interview process. Now we just interview for it. And so then it'll just be empirical, like have you done it or not. But I think the more probably bigger issue for all of us is how do we actually get an organization that where 90% of the people doing it will be the current people, because there's only so much amount of turnover, and that's maybe the much bigger project. So we have about 1,000 engineers, and our best practices so far are, first of all, just make sure everybody has the right tools, and this is also another situation where the delta between the wrong and right tool is more significant than I've ever seen before. The delta between the wrong model and the right model for coding is more significant than I've seen before. The engineer, using GPT-4 on, let's say, what the best-in-class software product was a year ago in the IDE space versus today using Cursor with Sonnet 4.5 is going to be night and day different levels of output. And so just imagine that in a 1-year period, you could have been doing the exact best practice a year ago, and a year later, you would be falling behind massively. There just has never been a period where that's been possible. So that's the first thing, is make sure everybody's got the right tools. Even if you were on Cursor with Sonnet 4.5, I would say your productivity just by default is maybe 20 or 30% higher than it was before. So that's great, but that's not yet really the kind of the real capability. The bigger capability is unleashed when you actually start to use agents that will code for you. And that's a mindset shift. That's why I can't predict it in advance, because I don't know who will go through that mindset shift. Sometimes we have the most senior people going through that mindset shift. Sometimes we have the most junior people doing it. So it's kind of like a priori, I don't know how to predict it in advance. But the biggest difference, and I think we all kind of know about this, is the engineer that decides that I am no longer a coder using AI to assist my coding, but I'm an engineering manager that manages AI agents. And my job is now to review their code and edit their code and integrate their code and give it feedback along the way. That mindset shift is the jump between a 20 or 30 or 40% increase in productivity gain from AI to a 3 or 4 or 5x productivity gain. And it's not going to happen everywhere in the stack.
Yeah.
So like our backend teams will not get a 5x productivity gain because we don't want them changing file system code and permissions, architecture with vibe coding, like obviously. But our front end teams, we have parts of the stack where we'd love for you to go and try and build a front end feature and just have the agent go and fully run it. And then your job is to go review that code. And that's where you start to get the kind of 2, 3, 5x improvement. And so that's the biggest jump. And the thing back to maybe that early X point, where we've learned that practice is actually from the smallest startups. So when you look at small startups today, like 5-person startup, maybe in Silicon Valley, but certainly elsewhere, the current practice is they will be 4 or 5 engineers, they will be in a room together, and they will be using Claude Code or Cursor or Codex, and they will basically have an army of 50 to 100 engineers worth of output. And they will be running all of these agents in parallel, automating parts of their code generation, still doing the work of you have to be an expert engineer because you have to review all of the stuff coming in. This is not something where you can kind of just make this up. You have to fundamentally be still good at engineering, but the output gains have been massive. So we've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out how do we take those practices, pull them into Box. So we'll carve off certain teams and say, we're going to mandate that this team has to code in this way, and we want to see what the output looks like. We've tried to do a lot of organic adoption as well, which gets you that, again, kind of 20, 30, 40% output. We do a lot of internal training and enablement, and we're kind of doing all of the collective set of best practices.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask you so how do you keep pace with this, right? And it sounds like you carve off, a team or two to go pilot it, but do you have a centralized team that's just constantly monitoring what's going on in the market, staying in touch with the startup community?
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of getting this balance of centralization and decentralization right it tends to be pretty important. So I focused on the engineering side, but now if we zoom out and kind of think about the rest of the organization, we kind of have every type of role within Box, so you can kind of imagine the full org chart. First of all, we want to make sure everybody has access to a few of the best tools that are kind of out there per line of business or job function. So in a decentralized way, we want lots of people just trying things because we'll never predict in advance, like somebody builds a Box AI agent for some sales workflow that we would not have anticipated. So that's great. We want them to go and build that. But then centrally, with a mix of myself, our chief operating officer, our CTO, head of engineering, our CIO, and then a few other folks, we kind of have. Right now, it's kind of loosely a council, and it's probably more formal for some of the governance elements. But that's where we want to make sure that we are centralizing what we're seeing across the business, and where we want to go and deploy maybe more of our top-down energy. And the top-down energy is sort of looking across the business and saying, okay, where can we actually go drive real, automation? And to do that, though, we're probably going to have to either incentivize the team differently, change some of the budget allocation, or change some of the workflows. And so we're kind of going throughout the organization, kind of department by department, and looking at it through that lens. We've told the whole company that we're going to be AI first in everything that we do. One explicit thing that we've been very unmistakably clear on, though, is that we're not doing that to save money. We're doing it to increase output. So we want everybody in a mindset of abundance, which is look at your team, look at your organization, and have a mindset toward how do you get more done with AI. There will be areas that we'll save money on, but the savings that we get, we will almost certainly repurpose back into the broader organization that found the savings. There might be like 1 or 2 exceptions where that's not the case, but for the most part, we might save from one area and by automating and driving some efficiency, but then deploy those dollars back into an area where we've never been able to invest because we just didn't have the capital freed up. And so we want to go AI first as a company. We want everybody to become highly fluent in AI. And then we want to have everybody sort of figure out what are your end user productivity use cases for AI, but then also what are the more top down, we're just going to go and re-engineer that process. Which gets into maybe the big asterisk, which is like transforming with AI is just it's non-trivial. And we've rarely found an organization where you just drop in AI and then it sort of
turn
just
the
gets
agents loose.
Yeah, the agent just goes loose and all of the great things happen. Like, it's not that simple. I think we've all collectively seen that. You saw that in the MIT study, et cetera. And so the big thing that behooves all of us is actually how do you instrument and re-engineer your workflows to get the gains from AI? And we can certainly get into like the what and why behind that. But
Yeah, well, it is fascinating. It almost feels like we're on that kind of standard, Gartner tech hype cycle
Yep.
curve, right? We've gotten a few articles over the last, couple months about maybe there's a little bit of disillusionment out there, right? We, scattershot,
Yeah.
took all these attempts at, POCs and all that.
Yeah.
How many of them actually scaled, right, and made it into production?
This is the thing that you're going to have to be super careful of, though. So I think the one difference from the Gartner normal trough of disillusionment, though, is this is going to be a scenario where we might think that the technology was not ready as a result of this, but actually it probably turns out it's things other than the technology. It's either the human change management. There's an element, and this is very biased coming from us, because this is what we're the hammer looking for nails, so we always see this problem, but half the organizations we go into don't have an AI problem, they have a data problem. Like their data is not ready to actually get any meaningful value from AI, because the classic problem is we've all built data estates over 20, 30, 40 years where it's relatively fragmented, because you didn't really need to consolidate it, because people were actually okay at like having multiple browser tabs open and going to that application for that data and then copy and pasting it over there. But the problem is agents are not gonna, they're gonna go haywire in that environment, because imagine if you have 3 or 5 different systems. Again, this is sort of what we see as an example. You have 3 or 5 systems that have all of your contracts, but some of the contracts are in a contract management system, some are in a data repository, some are in a signature tool. Now you tell Salesforce, now you tell an agent, go get me the latest contract. Well, which place should it go to?
Yeah.
The human would know, because the human was involved in the workflow. But the agent just dropped into your business process, knows nothing, right? It's a super intelligent thing that has absolutely zero context about your business. And so you drop in the agent, and it goes and roams around everything, and it finds a bunch of data that it thinks is right, but there was the wrong version, or you'd already updated that thing, or actually no, you ended up leaking that to the wrong person that shouldn't have had access. So that's a data problem. It's rarely an AI problem, but it will manifest as an AI problem because you tried to just sort of deploy agents into your current environment. So we have a lot of work to do just on that front. And so we're going to have this interesting thing, which is you'll see a trough of disillusionment in the bigger companies that will be totally different than what everybody's seeing, let's say, in Silicon Valley as startups. And it's this rare moment where you've got to be super clear on actually what's happening, which is we actually have a capability overhang. We actually have the ability to have agents do far more than what right now they're being deployed for. But it's usually because of the IT stack, the data environment, or the change management, not because the technology is not able to do that. Now, there's lots of things where the technology is just not ready yet, but the way that startups have reoriented everything they do sort of is the test case for if you could start from scratch.
Yeah, clean sheet it.
Yeah, if you can clean sheet your workflow, you actually can get huge gains. The problem is that we've tried to deploy AI into systems where we didn't clean sheet it, and lo and behold, we run into all these issues.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of organizations out there have decades of tech debt, right? Then all these siloed data stores that they have to try and unify and make sense of. So let's jump into a little bit more in the agents, because, like I said, I've been following you a ton. You I feel like, are one of the more pragmatic people online, certainly on X, and not, pushing the market hype here that you just flip the switch and the agents will go self-discover your environment, find all those data stores, and it reminded me.
Oh, they will, but they'll just leak all your data. In the process.
And this is not too dissimilar. In I think it was around 2005, 2006. We were early days of working with Google. They came up with an enterprise search appliance that you would drop into a rack in your data center. We deployed it at one of my clients. And it worked, but it worked too well. It found all the comp data for all the senior executives, and it exposed it in the web browser. So
100%. I mean, this is the thing. Like, just picture how many network file shares you have, or SharePoint sites that were over permissioned, and basically it was okay because like Bob was not going to go in folder 1943 down the tree, but the agent will. And the agent will find the salary data from Sally that Bob shouldn't have access to, and it will happily answer that question. And so that's actually what we're dealing with. And that is the gap between today, the promise that you see in the demo, between what can be deployed. So we, unfortunately, good news, bad news is we actually have a lot of work ahead of us. Maybe that's the bad news. The good news is actually nobody's really late. Like, despite all this hype, there's not that many companies that are so far out ahead. But now maybe the big asterisk on that is the startups are. And if you are in a space where startups can disrupt you, then the clock really is on.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about what you're seeing when you get into larger organizations with all that tech debt. How are you talking to them about, Box's products, how you would go attack this problem of agentifying their workforce?
Yeah, so I think the simplest concept for us is everybody's heard probably context engineering. And the simple concept is, right, so the AI model has a context window. And fortunately, the context window is growing. That's good. But it's got a finite amount of memory that it can work with at any given time about what it's trying to do. And so the whole game for all of us trying to deploy AI is how do you get the right context into that context window so the agent can do something useful. And the thing that has a lot of your context is your unstructured data. It's got your contracts, it's got your marketing assets, it's got your research, it's got all the best practices you ever wrote down. And the agents somehow need access to that information. So that's what I was mentioning earlier is we spent 2 decades building a content management system in the cloud that is not fragmented. It's one file system. It's got one access control list. It scales to effectively any amount of data. And so the problem that we're trying to solve is if you could then make that be an agent-friendly file system, and then ensure that all the different agents that a company deploys, whether they're deploying that on Agentforce or ServiceNow Agent Fabric or Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude, how do you get access to that data in the right way at the right time inside those agents? So just think about it as we all collectively have a massive context engineering problem. The agent has to have the right context, but for the agent to have the right context, it needs to have access to the data that the user should have access to, and you have to then make sure you have a system that is current on what should that user have access to. And importantly, I think what we see at least is in unstructured data generally belongs in many different applications context. So your contract maybe should show up in Salesforce in one instance, but then you might be in a ServiceNow workflow where you also want it to show up during some kind of contract lifecycle management process, and you don't want to replicate that data because again, the agent will then get confused, and it'll start to, it'll start to call the wrong data where you updated it, but now it's got the wrong version. So having a horizontal platform that connects to all these systems, we think becomes very important, and so that's why we work with everybody, because our whole mission is let's just federate into any system that you want, because we know the agents are going to live a lot of times in the system of record that you're working with. So we integrate with all these platforms, but usually the journey with most customers is, do you know what data you have? Is it set up in an environment that actually agents can easily kind of work with? Do you have access controls and permissions and data governance that supports both the user having access to that data and the agent having access to that data? And is it interoperable with your entire stack? So that's kind of the checklist I would go through, and that's the Box example, but I kind of use that checklist for all of the vendors we work with. I want to make sure that we're not stuck in any architectural pattern in anything that we deploy right now, simply because it's so early in the space. So the one reason that we're very bullish and partial to Cursor is Cursor just lets you choose your model, and they don't compete with any of the model providers. So we know that we'll get the latest version of Anthropic the moment that it releases. And versus if you overly are stuck with one particular vertical stack integrated approach, you're probably stuck with that model, and you're only going to get the updates at the rate that model provider updates. And so we kind of look at everything, whether it's our sales stack, our HR stack, our ERP system stack, and looking forward to that next conversation of how do we make sure that we have the right modularity in our architecture that agents can kind of pop into.
Yeah, right before Aaron and I came up on stage, Jerry Hoberman mentioned he was going to be talking ERP, or somebody else maybe mentioned it too. So Aaron just figured out he wins the prize because he was able to weave in ERP into the conversation.
I think I won the bingo thing.
Yeah. So Aaron, so you talked a lot about flexibility in the tech stack and architecture and being able to plug and play. Now, what about when you're thinking about it from the actual changing the way work gets done?
Yeah.
You've been commenting a lot on that, talking a little bit about, some people are trying to look at end to end. That might be too much to bite off. A lot of times it's kind of more middle out. Maybe you can spend a minute on that.
Yeah, this one is I've had to kind of evolve my own thinking on this. I think different workflows end up allowing or affording different approaches. The reason why we are in a rare moment where you should think about some of your workflows being re-engineered is because back to this idea of like, what is an agent good at? What is it, right? So think about it as, right, the AI model, super intelligent, zero context. It's going to show up in your organization, and one day it's going to be a lawyer, the next day it's going to be a marketer, the next day it's going to be a coder. It doesn't know, and it doesn't know if it works at Pepsi or Coke. It knows nothing, right? It's just super intelligence that needs to be told what to do. So if you think about it through our business processes, most of our business processes don't imagine having to tell another person all of these facts every time the workflow is started. Because the person comes in and they're like, I'm already a lawyer, I'm already a scientist, I've joined your organization, I kind of know what I do. I know that I walked into the Pepsi building versus the Coke building, and so I know how to kind of operate within the kind of general context of this organization. The agent doesn't know that. And so then if you think about, this is why you have so many failures of we drop in an AI agent into today's workflow, and it's like all of a sudden, it's like talking like a lawyer when it should be a marketer, or it's spitting out buggy code because it doesn't know all of your history of you fixed that problem, and this is the spec that you're supposed to kind of work off of. So maybe despite all of our attempts over years of like this idea like, oh, we're going to get so good at like writing down our process, and certainly bigger companies maybe are better at this, but like startups never did that. You're just kind of all running wild. Well, agents actually need that. They do need the clear description of exactly what they're supposed to do and who they're doing it for, and what are the kind of rough guidelines of what they should be working on. You'll see this trend emerge, which is if you use something like Claude Code, it's often generating, or you can create your own markdown files that basically where you list, it's basically its job function and the to-do list of what it should do. And you, over time, contribute more and more information into that markdown file of like, don't do this in the code base, do this thing, and always review your work. And all of those things actually end up working. The agent will actually go and read that markdown file and then remember to review its work because it was in the spec list. But again, we didn't write that down for people because we didn't really need to. And so the re-engineering part is, if you do want to get the upside of agents, you have to kind of think about like, how would you build this workflow from scratch if an agent was doing it? And what would you tell that agent to do? And then now, what would the human's role be in that workflow? And the reason I think I'm relatively pragmatic is that I don't think there's that many workflows where you can just let agents go wild. I think there's actually a high degree of human in the loop required, and I think it's going to be the case way longer than what Dario says. I think that you're going to have humans in the loop for a large number of the work that still needs to happen because we have not figured out how to get 99.999% accuracy on most things. Like, we should assume that there's going to be some asymptotic kind of point in most workflows where you get 95% success rate, let's say. So then you have to have humans review this stuff because nobody is in a business where 95% success rate is that useful. And so we should expect that the job function is still going to exist, but what that job does is different. It's like the IC, the individual contributor, is now the manager, and they're the manager of AI agents. And so how do you construct a workflow where that IC, it can deploy an agent and then actually review its work and then combine its work in a broader workflow? And so that's how the job is going to change. That's how the workflow has to change. And then frankly, we barely have enough we barely have software even built for that general approach. There's a few examples that exist in different kind of domains, but most software wasn't built for that approach. Either software was built for like, I'm going to fully deploy an agent and never see it again, or I'm going to get like type ahead, kind of like little like slight automation functionality. Mm-hmm. We are going to need software that is, I might be a lawyer and I deploy agents to go review my contracts, but come back to me with the equivalent of what I see in my IDE right now, which is like, here are the diffs. And I get to go see like all the different issues that I should be looking at. We don't have software built for that. There's a great podcast from Andrej Karpathy, interviewed by Dwarkesh Patel a couple weeks ago. Maybe folks have seen it. And Andre, who was one of the co-founders of OpenAI, sort of framed this in a really good way, which is engineering, we've sort of solved this problem, and he even argues that we're very early, because basically engineering is text in, text out. Everything is just a text editor, and all we're doing is writing text. And we've all basically standardized on basically one IDE, which is VS Code or its forks. And so you've got the cleanest slate for engineers to be able to do automation. You have a text interface that shows you what has changed about the code. We all have version control repositories that keep things kind of able to be controlled in a good way, where we can see the work that other people have done. And so now just an agent is that new worker. So like everything has been built primed for engineers. Now go look at your marketer's workflow, or go look at your your HR team's workflow, or your lawyer's workflow. It doesn't look anything like that. It's, some of it was on a Zoom call, and then the data's over here, and then it popped into a Slack, and then you got it in a chat, and then an email. And there's like 17 different systems. And it's not as simple as GitHub plus VS Code, and then an agent in between. Yeah. And so this is what's going to take a lot of time. And this is why we have to both be patient but ambitious, because there are things that will work right now. But we have to build out a lot of software to make that as easy as possible.
Yeah, and you have all these different mediums too, right? Marketers are dealing with video, images, all that. Well, the other exciting thing to me too is that I think leveling this up, it not only changes the actual jobs, but then it's going to actually change the actual organization, right? Because the lines start to blur on who's responsible for what, who can do what. Like, do you need to go to a contract manager to mark up a contract if you can get that first line of review? Yeah. Right?
So this is the thing that we think we're maybe like 6 months ahead of other companies on, just because we're trying to push the limits on this. On one hand, we're seeing the blurring of lines between job functions, because if you're in product marketing, if you kind of know the rough sort of marketing stack of a tech company, your product marketer really understands the product, and then it writes the marketing collateral, and then it hands over to a copywriter that might review it, and then that hands over to maybe a blog post writer that writes the blog post. That's basically, that job should be able to be done by a product marketer and AI. Those things we had to specialize them over time, because the skill sets were just different enough that you kind of had to have a really good writer and a really good blog post person and a really good product understander. Those will blur. And so it's almost inevitable that we'll have some collapsing of those types of functions over time. Conversely, I see a lot of areas where actually specialization might increase further, because AI is going to change the definition of the job requirement, and it's actually going to become even more specialized. So on the other end of the spectrum, we have these roles called sales engineers, and your teams have met them all, and they kind of prepare the product to be positioned for your technical teams. Now we have sales engineers using Cursor to build entire custom demo environments for the customer of their entire product with Box embedded into it. And now it's amazing, but we're actually spending more time, human time, in the sales engineering process, because AI has now made it affordable to do a 10x bigger impact in the sales motion. And so these are the things that all the economists always miss, is they think that our sales engineer will just do the exact same thing, and then AI will save 50% of their time, when actually we're going to double the amount of time that the sales engineer spends, because they're going to do something that would have taken 10 times longer to do previously that they just wouldn't have done. And so then actually you'll probably have even more specialization in sales engineering, because we collectively as an industry won't take a meeting with a sales rep that hasn't built out the entire working product for us. I don't want to see some generic demo. I want to see your product working in my environment. And so come back to me when that happens. And so now we're going to actually increase what that individual has to go do. So a lot of these things are very hard to predict. I would actually hate to be a university right now, because I wouldn't know what to teach people, because actually half the jobs that we thought are going to go away are going to be more important. And we don't really know how this is all going to play out. But that's how I kind of think about it across the organization, is you'll see some blurring, then you'll see some specialization actually increase. And over the long run, if I look at our company in 5 years from now, I think it'll look totally different than it would have 3 years ago if we had just predicted the extrapolated out. But it won't necessarily, I don't think it'll be fewer people. I think it'll be us doing more output, and then the people will be doing very different things. That'd be my current hunch.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we're seeing the same thing in our business. We've got the ability, one of our teams built a tool that will take an RFP. A lot of clients, specify out their requirements, sometimes a couple hundred pages, and 20 minutes later, a working demo comes out, fit to that spec. I mean, that's something that would have taken us weeks, if not months. Previously, we couldn't afford to do in a sales process, and now
totally. And this is the thing. So everybody kind of read about Jevons paradox probably maybe 6 months ago when DeepSeek happened. This became very popular to think about. Jevons paradox we generally think of as applied to like technical resources, like technology, but it actually will get applied to humans as well, which is in a world where you lower the cost of doing X thing, do you do X thing actually way more than the efficiency gain that you saved? And I think what we're going to find is there's a lot of parts of our organization or the economy that were very scarce before, and so you just didn't do. And so now with AI, you just start to do those way more, which means actually you hire more people to do those previously scarce things because now they're abundant. And we can't, very hard to predict those in advance because we don't yet know, like, what do customers now expect, from this whole experience? And then that, what is our competition doing? And so how do we evolve with that?
Yeah, well, Aaron, I'm like seeing over there, we're way over time.
Okay, great.
I could talk to you for another half hour at least, because we didn't even get to like tokenomics and how you're going to deal with all that increased inference cost. But
we don't want to get into that anyway.
We probably not. But look,
we don't know how we're going to pay for any of this.
And on that note,
exactly.
So I just want to thank you. This is a really fascinating conversation. I think really insightful, instructive for all of us. So thank you for being here. And
maybe my last TLDR.
Yeah.
I know that there's a different mixed audience, but at least for those on the IT side, maybe my message is, I think this is the coolest time ever to be in technology.
It is.
Jensen had this line of CIOs, sort of the new HR, and I may have worded it differently than he did, but the real impact that you now have in the IT organization, digital AI, et cetera, whatever the job function is, because you're basically powering the organization, not just building software for other people to use, is like a totally different world that we're entering. So pretty exciting time. So hopefully everybody is able to take advantage of that.
And a time of abundance, like you said.
We will get there.
Yeah,
so,
awesome. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone.